NASA's new space telescope has inspired people from all over the world and promises to fundamentally change our view of the universe. So why is it named after a bureaucrat who had nothing to do with astronomy and had nothing to do with this telescope? It wasn't until launch that I looked up who James Webb actually was. And like all astronomers, I was surprised and shocked. I had assumed that this Webb fellow had somehow played a key role in getting the telescope built. If you have followed the James Webb Space Telescope very closely, you may have noticed a pattern. NASA administrators and public relations people call it the Webb Space Telescope, but the vast majority of astronomers call it the JWST, often pronouncing it run together almost like a single word, which ends up sounding like Jews tea. Why is that then? Are astronomers in love with acronyms or speak about the JWST so often that they're trying to shorten it as much as possible? A lot of astronomers say Hubble, but they seldom say Webb. The reason may surprise some people. I am an astronomer. Although I make a living developing astronomy software for amateur astronomers, my training is in professional observational astronomy and physics. In the past, I've taught astronomy to college students, and in the process, I cultivated an interest in the history of science. Science is different from people-oriented vocations, such as the military or business management. It's natural to wish to memorialize those who came before us, to remember those who made a significant contribution. But in science, we're literally building an understanding of the universe, one block at a time. And scientists naturally celebrate those who added a significant block to this understanding. Now, I'm not saying one of these things is better than the other. They're simply different circumstances. But I think it's important to be true to this difference when we seek to memorialize someone. The JWST is the product of a large number of people coming together from many nations. It was built by engineers and managers and everyday people with the purpose of advancing our knowledge of the universe. It isn't about human space exploration, nor is it simply a technological achievement. It's a telescope. Its purpose is science, and its legacy will belong to the field of astronomy and to astronomers. The predecessor to the JWST is the Hubble Space Telescope. Hubble was an astronomer. He made one of the most fundamental discoveries in all of human history. In 1929, he discovered that the universe was expanding, which implied that it had a beginning. His name will be remembered 1,000 years from now, with the likes of Copernicus and Galileo. But naming that telescope after him was more than just paying homage to an admirable person from the past. The primary purpose of the Hubble Space Telescope is to better understand the expansion of the universe. You can find examples of people who didn't like Hubble as a person, and some say he was too interested in fame, to the point of not sharing it with others who made his work possible. By today's standards, he was a racist, and likely a male chauvinist. Yet few will deny how fitting it was to name this telescope after him. Space telescopes are not mere spacecraft. They are astronomical observatories, and in the past they've been named appropriately in consultation with the astronomers who would use them. Starting with Hubble, there's been a string of space telescopes. All those with memorial names have been named after astronomers or physicists, and each is tied to the work of that person in a significant way. The Chandra X-ray Observatory, Spitzer Space Telescope, Herschel Space Telescope, Planck Observatory, Kepler Mission, Fermi Gamma Ray Space Telescope, Swift Gamma Ray Burst Explorer, and Newton. I defy anyone to come up with a more appropriate name for the Hubble Space Telescope than Hubble. But we cannot say the same about the Webb, and there's something deeply wrong about that. In 2002, NASA Administrator Sean O'Keefe announced that he had unilaterally named the successor to the Hubble, the most important space telescope in decades, after former NASA Administrator James E. Webb. Astronomers were surprised because this flew in the face of tradition, and they had just assumed it would be more appropriately named. James E. Webb was the second administrator of NASA, from 1961 to 1968. About his selection, O'Keefe said, "Thanks to his efforts, we got our first glimpses at the dramatic landscape of outer space. He took our nation on its first voyages of exploration, turning our imagination into reality. Indeed, he laid the foundations at NASA for one of the most successful periods of astronomical discovery. I read that and I end up shaking my head. He's equating astronomical discovery with the spacecraft orbiting the Earth or visiting the moon. Anyone who understands what astronomers do and how large the universe beyond the moon and even our solar system is, understands that these are not the same thing. O'Keefe is a former engineer on nuclear submarines, and he had been Secretary of the U.S. Navy prior to his 3-year tenure at NASA, where he's primarily remembered for canceling all future Hubble Space Telescope servicing missions, claiming that it wasn't worth the risk. I submit that this man was not qualified to name the successor to Hubble, and that it was improper for him to do so unilaterally. So why did he choose Webb then? It is said that Webb played a key role in focusing NASA on scientific missions at a time when presidents were looking for quick wins in a human space race against the Soviets. But his rationale was not born out of a love of or a great appreciation of science. In his previous career with the State Department, Webb became known as the father of American psychological warfare. He believed that the U.S. could beat the Soviets in the Cold War by showing our better selves to the world. Scientific advancement was part of this Cold War strategy. There is no evidence that I can find that, to him, it was anything more than a political strategy. Look, if O'Keefe and others want to memorialize Webb, surely there is a more appropriate way. Let's talk about the elephant in the room for a minute. If you're familiar with the controversy with regard to naming this observatory, you'll have heard that at the State Department, Webb was involved with what is called the Lavender Scare, where gays were hunted down and removed from government service. While he was NASA administrator, NASA also fired gay men. Today, this justifiably concerned many astronomers, particularly those who are not heterosexual. They and their allies have petitioned NASA to rename the telescope, but they've been largely ignored. It's a tricky business to hold people from the past accountable to modern standards. People who admired Webb for other reasons naturally want to defend his name. Today, Sean O'Keefe says that he is not convinced that Webb was personally involved. Naturally, this fight has received all of the attention, but I believe that this is indeed a rotten tree. But there is a forest here that people are ignoring. This is hardly the only reason this name is inappropriate. I said before that I defy anyone to come up with a more appropriate name for the Hubble Space Telescope. It seems clear to me that the same can't be said for the Webb. Keep in mind, this telescope is an international project with substantial contributions from the European Space Agency. We should choose a name that we can all agree on, a name that celebrates astronomy, not an American bureaucrat. Not only does this name needlessly make some people very uncomfortable, it was never an appropriate choice in the first place. In the past, NASA has given provisional names to spacecraft until they've become operational. At that time, a more appropriate name is selected. It is not too late for NASA to do this now. There are so many great choices that celebrate those who advanced astronomy or physics for their direct contributions and that complement the mission of the telescope. When Hubble published his seminal paper, it consisted primarily of this one graph. Hubble had determined the distances to the galaxies on this plot. But to show the universe was expanding, he also needed measurements of the redshifts of these galaxies, which is the y-axis on this plot. Without those measurements, he had nothing. He obtained these redshifts from Besto Slipher, an astronomer at Lowell Observatory in Flagstaff. This contribution by Slipher was not properly attributed at the time. Hubble was happy to take all of the credit. I think it would be fitting to name this telescope after him. So how about the Slipher Space Telescope? But that's just one example. It could be the Allen Sandage Space Telescope. He was literally Hubble's successor. Or imagine the Einstein Space Telescope. Any of these names and a half dozen others would be so much more appropriate. Name a building after James Webb, or a spaceport or even a friggin' moon base. But this is a telescope. Why not give it an appropriate name? A name that reflects its astronomical purpose. A name that will match the inspiration of its impact on the world. A name that every astronomer can say with pride. A name that will bring a smile to everyone when they think of it.